Thank you so much for the intro, Sandra, and welcome to the second panel of the day. We're tackling a small subject, the new great geopolitical game. And of course, we're in a situation now where the post-World War II order is under threat. We have the war in Ukraine, the emerging war in Israel, and of course, China on the rise. And the United States and Europe, of course, battling political fatigue at this moment of crisis here. So I'm going to ask our distinguished panelists how the world can handle this. I'm Jack Detsch, Foreign Policy's Pentagon and National Security Correspondent. I'm lucky to be joined by Julie Smith, U.S. Ambassador and Permanent Representative to NATO. Happy to be joined by Klaus Welle. He is the Academic Council Chairman of the Martin Center and was in the European Parliament as the Secretary General for several years. On my left here, Arnaud Danjean is a member of the European Parliament and on the Subcommittee of Foreign Affairs and Defense. And then Karin von Hippel is the director of the Royal United Services Institute, a think tank in London. So thank you all for your time. Ambassador Smith, I want to go to you first to talk about the situation in Israel, obviously outside of your remit to a degree, but a major test for the international community. I'm curious how you think it's handling this moment and if there's a EU and NATO angle here to support the Israelis in this current war with Hamas.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's nice to see you, Jack, and thanks to all the organizers. Just to say at the top, obviously the events over the weekend were absolutely unspeakable, an unspeakable tragedy. Collectively, I think it's safe to say that all the members of the NATO alliance have condemned the terrorist attacks that occurred against Israelis. We are fully united in that perspective. We agree that Israel has every right to defend itself. And I think looking forward, we are going to have an opportunity. We're going to have all of the NATO defense ministers coming to town either this evening or tomorrow morning for both another meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, but also a defense ministerial. It's hard to imagine that the tragic events in Israel won't be a part of that conversation. We'll have to see exactly how we fit that specifically into the schedule. But in terms of a NATO role specifically, I don't think anyone's suggesting a NATO role. For the United States, obviously, we have a very important bilateral relationship with Israel, a long-standing commitment that is unwavering to their security. That will not change. You've seen an announcement by the United States to move the USS Gerald R. Ford closer to Israel as a deterrent. There are other steps that the United States is taking to provide assistance. But I'll leave that really in the hands of my colleagues back in Washington, since, again, NATO's specific role as it relates to events in Israel is somewhat limited.
Well, I do want to touch on that with you before I move on to the rest of the panel. Obviously, a major political pulse check for the Biden administration here. You have to aid Israel. You have the aid package coming up for the Ukrainians. The consensus seems that they'll be merged together. Do you have confidence that Congress is going to move ahead after they've just knocked off the Speaker of the House?
I have confidence that the United States is going to be able to maintain the commitments that it has both to Israel's security and to ensuring that our friends in Ukraine have what they need to defend themselves against continuing unprovoked Russian aggression. I don't see a challenge in meeting those two commitments, and I am confident, I think the President's confident, that we will be able to deliver in both cases.
Klaus, I wanted to turn to you really fast. Of course, Russia has had a relationship with Hamas in the past. Russian diplomats have had close ties. There's been visits to Moscow. Is there concern in Europe, in Brussels, that Russia could exploit the chaos further, just given the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine?
I think Russia is waging war in Europe already against Ukraine, so it's very difficult to see how they could, let's say, be even more detrimental to security. But yes, it's true. They might wish that the United States maybe are getting distracted, that all the attention is deviated to Israel and to the actions of Hamas, and that the war in Ukraine is going to go a little bit into the background. But I think this is not going to happen. The United States is committed to supporting Ukraine. The European Union is committed to supporting Ukraine. And we are committed because this is about the rules in the 21st century in Europe. Russia tries to reestablish empire We know what this means from our own history, whereas we are offering the European Union of citizens and states. And Russia is afraid it's not competitive with its own proposal. It's afraid that Ukraine could become a success model and therefore destabilize its own regime. So this is not over. This is not a regional conflict. This is something which is fundamentally about the order of Europe in the 21st century, and that's why we are not going to be distracted.
Well, want to touch on that more in a minute. Arnaud, I wanted to get your perspective on what's going on in the EU. Obviously, the EU has made a decision now to review the funding that goes to the Palestinian Authority, the largest foreign funder of the Palestinian Authority. That doesn't seem to stop the money, though. I'm curious, what's next? Obviously, Borrell and the 27 foreign ministers meeting right now as we speak. What do you expect to be the next step in the Eurozone?
Well, this debate about aid, I don't think there will be a freezing of the aid as such, because most of the aid of the EU, if not all the aid, goes to the West Bank, not to Gaza. So this flow is not direct to Hamas, of course. And there is a need still to dissociate the terrorist group Hamas, which has to be crushed, and it will happen, I think, and the rest of the Palestinian population, especially in the West Bank, with humanitarian aid and also what we are providing. So I don't think this will stop, but it has to be reviewed indeed. That's what we are also asking for as parliamentarians. We had already meetings this very morning in the parliament. We will have a debate next week. We have a plenary session in Strasbourg next week, so that will be on the top of the agenda, of course. And we will see. But of course, the time now is for support and solidarity to Israel, and that's unquestionable. And that's the mood in the European Parliament from all political groups, and that's a unanimity that we would like to see more often. After that, we will have to think about what to do in this region, because even if you have a military offensive against Hamas in Gaza, you will have to find a solution anyway, political solution. And we all know that it's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but we have to continue our efforts. So EU will have to play a role, political role, economical role probably. Security-wise, I think our means are very limited, and it's anyway up to Israel now to decide what they want to do. They have the right to self-defense. It's not questionable either. So we'll see. But when it comes to this aid question, I think there was yesterday something very useless from Commission side, from some commissioners. I mean, Commission is a collective body, and the Commission in this regard has to also get political guidances from the Council when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to freezing things, and it has to be worked out very, very thoroughly, and not the way it has been done yesterday.
Well, you said this was a useless response. Is the Eurozone going to be useful in this? And do you see this ending in a negotiated settlement? Certainly the Israelis say they want to destroy Hamas.
Yeah, but I told you, there is no ambiguity about Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist group. It has done a terrible terrorist attack against civilians, something unprecedented on the very soil of Israel. So Hamas will be punished, so to say, for that, militarily speaking. There is no doubt about the Israeli determination, and I cannot object to that. Yeah. But having said that, Hamas is not the whole Palestinian people, and Gaza is not the whole Palestinian territory. So what about the West Bank? I mean, we will have to live with this for decades to come. And so a military offensive, as legitimate as it is right now, will not bring the solution for the long-term perspective of the Palestinian territories.
Dr. von Hippel, want to get back on topic and kind of take a 30,000-foot view where this fits within the great power competition and great power conflict in the 21st century. Is this a situation where the foundations are so shaky with what's going on in Ukraine, with China's emergence, that non-state actors like Hamas can now take advantage?
I mean, thank you, by the way, for inviting me. It's great to be on this panel with very distinguished guests. I think, of course, yes, Hamas probably thought that Israel was weakened because we had months and months of protests in Israel. They were obviously concerned about the Saudi-Israel agreement or potential agreement that was under negotiation, and so they wanted to strike. But I don't think it's I wouldn't describe it as chaos. I just think that powers are readjusting, and smaller countries are asserting themselves in ways that we haven't seen before. And so it's just getting far more complicated. It's getting, I know there's a big debate about are we in a multipolar world or not, but I think you even published a very good piece the other day on that. But certainly power is more diffuse than it was. We have obviously the rise of China, US-China competition, but it isn't the case that we're going to be in this binary situation where countries have to decide. I think countries are going to work with China sometimes, work with the US other times. I think in terms of this particular crisis, and it really, I agree with Ambassador Smith, it's just so tragic, not only the civilians killed in Israel, but also civilians killed in Gaza as well, that China didn't condemn the terrorist attack, and I think the Israelis were upset about that. I think they thought they had a closer relationship with the Chinese. So some countries are kind of playing a bit of a backseat, saying we want the violence to stop, but they're not condemning the attacks like the Americans and the Europeans are. But I think behind the scenes, pretty much every country, including in the Middle East, the Arab countries and the Gulf countries would like Hamas to be destroyed.
Well, we'll get to our pivot to the Indo-Pacific in a minute. But I wanted to turn back to Ambassador Smith because this comes within the middle of a very, very busy week already at NATO. You have the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. You have the NATO Ministerial. You have Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin landing probably in a few hours here now in Brussels. What's on the menu for these meetings? And more specifically, what's up with Sweden's accession? It seems like Turkey has reared its head again in terms of blocking that.
So a couple of things. I mean, the UDCG, as folks know, is a monthly exercise. It's an opportunity for the 50 countries that are providing security assistance to come together and hear directly from the Ukrainians what their current needs are. We never quite know what they're going to come in with, but I think it's pretty easy to predict this time around that the emphasis, no doubt, will be on air defense and ammunition, more 155s, and as much air defense as possible. And I say that for two reasons. First and foremost, those are real-time needs on the battlefield, and the fighting continues. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that was the key focus for the UDCG. But also it's a focus because winter is coming, and what we've seen in the past, last winter, is a Russian desire to really plunge the Ukrainian people into darkness and cold. And they do that by going after civilian infrastructure, critical infrastructure. And so air defense is no doubt a critical component of their ability to harden their critical infrastructure against those potential attacks. So we'll see how that unfolds, but my prediction is, one, you will see additional assistance being put on the table, and two, I think the Ukrainians will focus largely on air defense and ammunition. For the Defense Ministerial, we're going to have the very first ever NATO-Ukraine Council with defense ministers, which is a new configuration where Ukraine sits as an equal at the table and allows us to talk about everything from cybersecurity to maritime issues to their membership aspirations. And we're glad to have the opportunity with Ukraine's new defense minister to jump in and get to work on NATO business with them. But we'll also be talking about these new regional plans that we rolled out at the Vilnius summit. And we have a lot to do to implement and execute those plans, so that will be no doubt a key focus. On your question about Sweden, I mean, the deal that was made at the Vilnius summit, President Erdogan arrived at the Vilnius summit and committed to finalizing the process. It was a question in July about whether or not there was enough time on the clock for the Turkish parliament to take this up. I think folks understood that it would likely happen in October when their parliament would reconvene after the break. So they are back in session, and there's a strong desire on the part of the alliance to now get this done. And so we have the full expectation that not only Turkey will move forward with the ratification process, but we want to see Hungary do the same thing. So that could be part of the conversation at the upcoming defense ministerial, but I think our position, not only in the United States, but around the alliance is clear. Sweden is ready for membership, and it's important not only for Sweden's security, but it's important for alliance security because of the role that Sweden's going to play in the Nordic Baltic region in particular, but really across the alliance as a whole.
Is there still life left in this Ukrainian counteroffensive before the winter sets in? Seems like the Pentagon wants them to keep fighting through the winter.
Well, we leave that determination to our friends in Ukraine. What they've signaled to us is they will keep fighting into the fall, into the winter. We'll leave it in their hands. Our role is to get them the support that they need to do that.
Wanted to talk to you, Klaus, about the problem of industrial gravity that the Ukrainians are facing. Obviously, the West can't produce enough ammunition right now. Admiral Rob Bauer, NATO's military chief, has talked about that very specifically. What needs to be done in the West to produce enough ammunition to help the Ukrainians? And not to mention now, you have the Israelis asking for more U.S. and Western military aid, and you have a potential conflict with China on the horizon.
My view is that we are having not only a temporary but a structural problem here. The structural problem is that we don't have an internal market for armament products, which means that we are producing small series, which means that we are producing too expensive. And then in times of need, we might be dependent on countries like South Korea. And I hope the Polish soldiers fit into South Korean tanks. I hope this very much. So we need to ramp up our own production capacity. That's what the Commission is doing. We need to have a real internal market on armament products, which is not hollowed out by national exceptions. We will need to invest into transport and logistics. This is not for today, but in any kind of conflict, if you can't get your military equipment where it's needed, it's pretty useless. That's, I think, a very important idea for the next MFF negotiations. We have a budget line, but it's far too small. I think we need a kind of EU DARPA. The United States has their own research program, which is both for military goods, but also for civilian. We need something like this in preparation of the next MFF. And we will need to close the strategic holes which we are having, transport capacity and satellite and also in intelligence. So we need to do now what can be done now by pooling whatever we have and providing with the Ukrainians. But I think this has to be a major wake-up call because the conflict with Russia is something that is probably going to drag on for years, if not decades. And therefore, we need structural reforms in the European Union to be better prepared next time.
Arnaud, it sounds like what Klaus is talking about is the EU becoming more of a military power. Is that what you see the future of the European Union being? And are your colleagues in the EU comfortable with that?
Well, I've been fighting for this for at least 2 or 3 decades in different capacities, but it's still, I mean, we're still far from that. We have to be honest, but it has improved. I think at least first there is a kind of awakening. People are aware, and I think all governments in Europe are aware that more needs to be done. It was not always the case, far from that. So it's first good point. For the political will, it is there. Now, how do you translate that? Of course, you have a lot of things that can be done through budget. And Klaus has mentioned some instruments that were already put in place. It will be necessary, but it's not enough. My I have 2 main, I would say, concerns when it comes to the sustainability of the efforts that we are seeing now in Europe. The first concern is the resilience of our societies, because I fear that at some point, even if the question of the material support to Ukraine remains open, we have a kind of a fatigue within our societies. We should not underestimate that. We have seen some electoral process In Europe, in Slovakia, elsewhere, in my own country, in France, we have to be vigilant. We have to make sure that the people remain committed to our efforts in helping Ukraine. It is not a done deal, contrary to what we hope. Second issue is, I would call it reversibility. I think that the government have understood that they have to provide a lot of efforts to sustain defense capabilities in the long run. But we know that priorities can shift very easily, politically speaking. So I hope that when it comes to budgetary commitments, fiscal commitments, and capabilities, we remain on board. All governments remain on board, because I know that it can, defense can be easily sacrificed. If you have a social crisis, if you have economical crisis, energy crisis, and we are not totally immune from that, then priorities can shift, and then defense become second priority. So we have to be very careful with this.
Dr. von Hippel, I'm curious how you see the EU's foreign policy priorities, and there doesn't seem to be as much consensus within Europe about how to deal with China. Some folks want to placate China more. Some folks want to take the more hard tack that we've seen in Washington. How should Europe be striking that balance?
Look, I think Europe is only going to get more complicated if it expands and accepts new members, and I hope it does accept Ukraine and other members in the near future, because that's really the best conditionality. That's the best way for Ukraine to reform its own internal administration, to deal with corruption issues that Ukrainians really do want to confront. So that will get more challenging, and I suspect we will return to more of smaller alliances of the willing and the capable. So not every country needs to do everything. Of course, yes, greater efficiencies and developing weapons, and not everyone needs exact same weapons in every country, but I suspect we'll see more smaller alliances, as we've seen already in Ukraine, including with the United Kingdom. Even though it's not in the EU, it certainly will play an important role in this going forward. So it's going to get more complicated, but of course, Ambassador Smith mentioned the winter coming. Let's also not forget the US elections are coming, and that will be an enormous challenge if former President Trump wins, and that really will change the equation, and then the Europeans really will have to do significantly more to maintain support to Ukraine.
Fair enough. I wanted to touch on the China piece with you, Ambassador Smith. Obviously, China has been a footnote in the last two statements out of the NATO annual meetings, both at Madrid and at Vilnius. What's NATO's role on China? Obviously, you've expanded your staff to get more China experts as well.
Well, it's really a remarkable story, and I think one that NATO allies are quite proud of. First and foremost, for the first time in NATO's 74 years, we were able to insert the Indo-Pacific and the PRC into the strategic concept. That was a major turning point for the alliance to recognize China as a systemic challenge and something that we needed to focus on. We've spent quite a bit of time really agreeing on the fundamental nature of the challenge, and now what we need to do is really essentially a shift from assessing the challenge to addressing the challenge. And part of addressing it comes in our partnerships with the 4 Indo-Pacific partners of Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. These 4 countries were present at the Madrid summit last year. They were present again at the Vilnius summit. I think it's safe to assume they'll join us in Washington next year at the 75th anniversary. And fundamentally, what we're doing is we are not expanding the alliance into the Indo-Pacific, but we are looking for ways to deepen these relationships in the Indo-Pacific because we see utility in breaking down the traditional silos. Years ago, the United States focused primarily on its Atlantic allies and then in other forums on its Pacific allies. But in lots of ways, we're all finding creative ways to bring together Pacific and Atlantic allies to look at shared challenges so that we can talk about how best to tackle hybrid threats, disinformation, economic coercion, how do we maintain our technological edge, cybersecurity. So So what we've done inside the NATO alliance is look for opportunities to bring in our friends from the Indo-Pacific, sit and compare notes with them on the Russia-China relationship, on how the Indo-Pacific partners are grappling with China challenges, how Europeans are grappling with the Russia challenge, compare notes, get stronger, learn from one another. So I think generally we're on a good course, and I guess I'd argue with your premise from the last question. I don't think it's so much of the United States taking a harder approach and Europeans taking a softer approach. I think there's actually a lot of agreement right now. We're focused collectively on this challenge. There can be different national approaches, no doubt, but I think if you look at the US-China strategy and its focus on invest, align, and compete, I think you see similar threads in documents either coming out of the European Union or in some of the Indo-Pacific strategies that you see coming out of national governments of Europe. So yes, there are still some differences, but by and large, I think just over the last 3 years, we've seen Europe and the United States coming together to grapple with this challenge while they're bringing in partners from the Indo-Pacific. So generally, I think this is a good news story about the progress we've made really since, I would say, 2018, 2019.
Klaus, how far can Europe's collaboration with Asia go? Obviously, you mentioned the Poles buying South Korean tanks. Is there a step further to go?
I mean, when you're in Washington, you sometimes meet office holders who are called directors for Eurasia. So the United States has a habit to look at the landmass as one, and I think we have to learn a little bit from this. Europe is just the most western edge of that landmass, and the eastern edge, therefore, has to concern us as well. If, for example, Taiwan would be with military force incorporated into China, the world would be a different place because the Philippines wouldn't be secure, Japan wouldn't be secure. We know that Japan is producing 96% of the most highest developed semiconductors, so it would touch us massively, plus the sanctions regime then as well. So we cannot say this is not our issue. We will have to bring in a specific European viewpoint. The situation, I think, is extremely dangerous. Alex Stubb said in the last panel, this is not like the Cold War, but if we are looking like parallels, then it's more maybe like the situation before the First World War, where an up-and-coming industrial power started a huge fleet-building program, which China is doing, challenging the established power, and we know that by 2030 this will have reached a degree of maturity that maybe the Chinese could be tempted to use what they are building now. So extremely dangerous. We are concerned, therefore we have to work very closely with the United States, but there are also specific European interests that have to be brought into the debate.
Well, I could ask questions all day, but I want to bring our audience into this. Sandra, I believe we have the poll results ready, so would love to hear what our audience is thinking about Europe's role in foreign policy.
This is correct, Jack. I'm coming back with a question we asked you at the beginning of this panel discussion. The question was, where should the EU focus its energy in order to engage its partners and its adversaries? The most of you, 74%, replied C, a combination of both. 22% of you replied that the EU should focus its energy in bilateral relations, and only 4% of our audience replied that it should be in multilateral fora. Thank you, Jack.
Fascinating results, Sandra. I just wanted to pose one more to you, Arnaud, before we go into questions from our audience. I'm curious how you see the political willpower in Europe now. Robert Fico, obviously victorious in Slovakia, still assembling his coalition, but it looks like you see sort of the rise of some more nationalist leaders, some more anti-Ukraine leaders in Europe. How is that affecting policy?
Yeah, indeed. I think it's a very important question. It becomes a question not only of domestic politics in each member state. It's not a question of the political balance within the institution. It becomes a strategic question. Strategic question, it's not just about armaments. It's not about the balance of power on the international scene. Now it becomes within our own societies on the political spectrums. You mentioned Trump coming back to power, which is an assumption. In France, you could have an extremist party coming to power, pro-Russian party coming to power. I mean, the margin is not so big. You have the rise of AfD in Germany, Fico coming back in Slovakia. So this strategic orientation of the European Union and of each member state is now a question of domestic politics as well. And this mix of the two dimensions is something we have to pay a very strong attention to. That's why, to me, resilience of our societies is almost a daily struggle, because you can have the best strategy you want towards Ukraine, you can have the most sophisticated strategy you want towards China. Everything will collapse if your political forces at home collapse, you know, and extremists and populists come to power, which is not a fantasy, you know, it can happen. So this is something we have to pay attention. We have electoral perspective next year in the US, in Europe for European elections. I still believe that mainstream forces can achieve a lot, that they are still credible, that also we have seen that Ukraine in that regard was a kind of a game changer, because even some very pro-Russian nationalistic forces in several member states, including mine, could not decently support what Russia was doing. So there was a kind of a wake-up call, and there was unanimity in Europe. But we have seen over the last couple of months, you know, some differences. You have Hungary playing his own game. And now the unanimity within the Council here in the European Union is not as robust as it used to be at the beginning of the war. So we have to be very, very careful. We should not contempt all this populistic movement, you know, and say, okay, they are totally crazy or non-rational, and reason is on our side, so we will prevail. I think it's a huge challenge. It's a very serious challenge, and you can, once again, put the light on the destabilizing role of China, of Russia, of Iran, name it. But the primary challenge is at home.
Well, Dr. von Hippel, you brought Trump into the conversation in the last round. Can the transatlantic alliance, as we know it, endure another Trump term?
I think it would be very difficult, and I think Europe would do many things separate from the United States when the U.S. wasn't willing to play. So I think it'll really change the American power structure. But if I could also just add on to something that Arnaud said about the concern about resilience at home, there's also a concern about the 35-plus countries that abstained at the UN General Assembly vote twice over condemning aggression in Ukraine. So not even many countries around the world, from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, they don't come from one area. They're no longer buying into what we see as Russian aggression. Many of them are actually more sympathetic to the Chinese and the Russian narrative about these conflicts. So it's getting far more complicated, and I think there's a lot of work to do domestically, but there's certainly a lot of work to do in many of these places. It's not about buying support or building new partnerships. It's about trying to understand what the challenges are in these places and figuring out how to establish more longer-lasting alliances, really.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to turn it to our audience, since I already promised that and I'm delayed. So we have microphones going around. If you have a question, please make it a question and not a comment. Sorry, common disclaimer. And take a reasonable amount of time, about 30 seconds. That's all I ask. Yes, this woman over here was first.
Hello, thanks. My name's Sandra Kaduri from Keeping Channels Open, a dialogue network. So if one of our goals is to encourage more effective regional approaches to stability, what's your message to countries in the Middle East in resolving the current Israel-Hamas conflict? How do we keep the Saudi-Israel peace process alive? And how talk to our friends in the region about stopping funding of extremist groups? Difficult conversations, but we can't only be pragmatic. We have to enter into difficult conversations.
Ambassador Smith, you're the U.S. official in the room. I know it's a little bit out of your AOR, but Any thoughts?
It's tough because obviously the NATO piece of this is far removed from trying to solve a series of regional crises in the region. I will say that NATO does have a series of partnerships across the Middle East. We are looking for ways to deepen and strengthen those partnerships so that first and foremost we can just listen and hear from them what are their immediate concerns where they believe NATO could play a constructive role. In some cases, the answer may be nothing. In other cases, it may be more specific. We want assistance with maritime security, with disinfo, with cyber. But we have to turn to these partners and hear from them first and foremost what their expectations are vis-a-vis the alliance, and we'll take it from there.
Arnaud, curious about your thoughts, and also if normalization is off the table right now between Israel and Saudi, if that's a challenge for the Europe.
Well, actually, I think one of the issues we should tackle, we were talking about freezing or not freezing or reviewing aid towards the Palestinian. We have another problem, which is our strategic partnerships with some states in the region. When I see the last messages coming from Hamas leadership, it was coming from Qatar, very openly, broadcasted live. So this is a problem. How do you portray Qatar? Is it like-minded country? Is it an ally? Is it so? On some dimension, yes, it is an ally. On some dimension, it's a partner. But on some dimension, it's problematic. Qatar is funding Gaza. I don't think everything goes to humanitarian aid, right? So, and compared to the funding of the EU, it has nothing to do. I mean, the scale is huge. So, Turkey, Hamas leadership is always welcome in Turkey. Hamas is a terrorist group, and we have evidence now. I mean, even for those who were trying to elaborate on the armed group and so on. I mean, what has been done this weekend is terrorism. Nothing. It's barbarism. So you cannot find any excuse for that. And we have close partners like Turkey, Qatar, hosting these people. So this is a concern. We should review that as well. It has to be put on the list of things to be reviewed after what has happened. On the Palestinian, I mean, it takes two to tango, okay? Peace talks, well, we all dream of peace talks. Who you talk to? On the Palestinian Authority, there is no credibility. And on the Israeli side, there is no willingness to engage with the Palestinian Authority for good or bad reasons. So, I think it will not be solved anytime soon anyway. So we have to be prepared for, unfortunately, a very confused situation for months and probably years to come. It doesn't mean that we don't have any leverages, but we have also to be very well aware that if things have to change, there is also an approach. We have to re-engage, because what happened also in recent years is that we forgot about this issue, and we thought more or less that it would be solved magically. It won't. And we also let an Israeli policy which was quite damaging towards the Palestinian Authority. Can we continue like this? I don't think so. Probably we will have to re-engage the US, Europe, but it will take a long time.
Jack, can I just add?
Yeah, I mean, you dealt with the problem of ISIS back in the day. How do you deal with problematic allies that have ties with terror?
Well, it's not even that. I was going to add on to Sandra's list. It's not just about the Saudi-Israel process, which is on hold, and of course, Israeli-Palestine, that real need for change. It's been frozen for too long, as you've said. But of course, don't forget, there's a lot of concern about this war expanding, that the Israelis might attack Iran, or Lebanon might get, or not Lebanon, but more Hezbollah might get more involved. So I think that the deterrence factor provided by the United States, by the Europeans and others is helpful, but we don't know where this is going to go. So it's a little bit, there's more to be worried about than not.
Yeah, we don't know indeed. Would love to get another question from the audience if we have, yes, this man in the champagne color.
Hi everyone, my name My name is Manuel Ballotta, and I'm a researcher for Vocal Europe. I wanted to ask, because we have talked about how the EU and NATO have engaged with other parties, both from a security perspective in this very polarized world, and we haven't talked about India, and I wanted to ask if the EU, mostly from the EU perspective, how it can engage both economically and from a security perspective, since India it's very independent foreign policy, especially towards Russia, and I wanted to ask if there were ways to engage. Thank you.
Arnaud, what's the India angle?
Well, I will first answer as a French. We have a strategic partnership with India, and I think it's working quite well, and I'm quite happy we can do that. And it leads me to, sorry for just a few seconds more, you were talking about China, Indo-Pacific. We have to be aware that European Union is talking a lot about Indo-Pacific. Trade-wise, it makes sense. But when it comes to security issues, we have only a very few number of member states able to deploy capabilities. So it's an objective limitation of the ambition of the European Union to play a significant role security-wise in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, beside France and Germany, and France is an Indo-Pacific country because of overseas territories. So we have troops, we have inhabitants, but for the European Union, we have to understand that it's very far away from us in terms of security and providing security in the region. Having said that, yes, the key word is partnership. So we have to engage with partners, and India is obviously one of them. We have this trade negotiations, which have restarted after 13 years of freezing. So it's quite encouraging, even though I don't expect a spectacular breakthrough in the coming months, but at least the process is there. And there is also a strategic dialogue with India. I think we Europeans, we have also to understand, not to lecture others. We have to understand the specificities of Indian foreign policy. It's not by chance that India is positioning itself the way it does, but we have to find the common grounds, and we have a lot in common. So I would put aside some irritants. There are, and we cannot neglect that, but I think overall the relationship is improving, even strategically, and it's quite encouraging. And of course, I would like India to take a more I would say, a clear-cut approach towards what's going on in Ukraine and the Russian aggression, but I can also understand where we come from and where India comes from. So it will not happen overnight, and we should have some understanding for this position. But all in all, it's going in the right direction.
I want to take a question from our online audience in a moment, but I just wanted to pose this to Ambassador Smith, because you did mention the expanded NATO table, if you would, not allies, but countries in the Indo-Pacific that are having a seat at the table. Is there a seat at the table for the Indians?
Well, India has not yet expressed an interest in developing some sort of formal partnership relationship with the NATO alliance. That said, I think for the United States, we certainly value the bilateral relationship that we have with India. We appreciate the leadership that they've been able to provide in the G20. And should folks in India, the government, at some point be interested in even a dialogue with the NATO alliance, I don't think they'd find any resistance. But we're not pushing for it. This is this is a decision for each sovereign nation to take, and it's entirely up to a country whether or not they want to pursue either an informal or formal partnership with India, with the alliance.
Understood. A question from our online audience to the panel. How do you see the capacity of the West to deter aggressions by competing powers? And are sanctions still an effective tool? And by the way, there's the Martin Center paper that's floating around on sanctions by Vladimir Mylov to check out. But I wanted to pose that to Dr. Van Hippel, because RUSI has done a lot of work on Russian sanctions evasion.
Right. It's an enormous challenge, yes, and I would encourage you to go to our website where we have a lot of publications on this subject. We have a team here actually in the RUSI Europe office that's doing a lot of great work on that and really looking deeper at how countries are evading Russian sanctions. And of course, the Russians have been very clever about buying components, off-the-shelf components, often in different countries, or components that may be banned, but they've been very good at that for decades. So that's not a new skill. So I think it's also about countries getting smarter about how to tighten sanctions. It's about countries sharing more information and much more awareness.
Klaus, to you, I mean, we've talked about the industrial challenge. It seems like the Russians are still able to load their guns, to build weapons in spite of these sanctions regimes.
Yeah, that seems to be the case, but it's also pretty obvious. I mean, trade between the European Union and some neighboring countries with Russia has skyrocketed. And it's not, there's no reason to be found why suddenly there is so much more need in those countries. So obviously, via third countries, Russia is able to circumvent the sanctions regime to a certain extent. But still, it's doing, I think, important damage. I would like maybe to add one word to India, if I'm allowed. When I was Secretary General of the European Parliament, I started an exchange program with the Indian Parliament, and they started to send every year 25 staffers over there to the European Parliament. And I've learned that for India, the European Union is a very good partner because we have very little baggage. We are not Britain, we are not the United States, we are not China. And let's not forget, India is not a super centralized entity. They have about as many languages as we have. I think about 2 years ago, they managed to introduce a kind of harmonized regime for value-added tax. So there are many, many similarities. And therefore, I think the European Union can play a key role with India. And by the way, I'm going next month to India for a week, and I've started also a partnership with the Nehru University in India, just to be present in that debate.
Ambassador Smith, sanctions have been the U.S. tool du jour of foreign policy. Are there more tools that are needed in the toolkit?
I think what we've seen really in the terms of the response to what Russia has done in Ukraine is an unprecedented use and application of sanctions. It is not the only tool in the toolkit, but it's no doubt an important part of the transatlantic approach in applying pressure on Moscow and ensuring that the Ukrainians have the support that they need. But look, we've got a wide array of tools that we've been able to use. We're isolating Russia, we're using the sanctions, we're reinforcing the eastern flank, individually providing support to the Ukrainians, humanitarian, economic, security assistance, housing their refugees, largely in Europe, but also in other countries. So I think it's an important tool. It's not the only tool. I would agree with Dr. von Hippel in terms of how we've been able to have a more detailed, coordinated approach as it relates to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And I do think it has been effective, but it is not a magic instrument that always immediately yields the results that you intend. In some cases, it can take time, but I think depending on what economic indicator you're looking at, I think there is evidence that the sanctions have had an impact on what's been happening inside Russia and their ability to cope with the consequences of this war in Ukraine.
Arnaud, is the approach working?
Well, I would say, I would echo what has been said. Sanctions are effective, but they are not decisive, in the sense that too often I see my colleagues here in Brussels having sanctions like a kind of a magic tool that will solve the issue. Okay, we apply sanctions, job is done. I mean, morally, I do understand the position, but the problem is how effective is it? Probably in the long run, it has impact, but I hardly remember sanctions which have been decisive. To be decisive, sanction have to be unanimously or as unanimously as possible in implementation, which is far from being the case in the case of Russia. I remember, of course, South Africa, for example, it had a real decisive impact because the whole world was united in boycotting South Africa at the time. Former Yugoslavia, at the time of Milosevic, somehow, yes, he wanted to escape sanctions because, I mean, the pressure was high. But still, it took years to provide some result. Other examples where it did not work. Iran is under sanction for years, Cuba has been under embargo and sanctions for years. The regime have not collapsed. Syria. Syria is an interesting case. I remember a French foreign minister few months after a regime of sanction has been established over Syria, saying, well, within 6 months, he's done. Talking about Bashar al-Assad. He's going to run out of cash. If you see one dictatorship in the world running out of cash, call me. I'm very interested. Never happens. So we should be very lucid about sanction. Yes, we have to apply sanctions. Yes, it's effective, but be careful, it's not decisive alone. And I think we have also to get a very targeted system of sanctions. Interestingly, within the European Union, we have some sanctions that have been challenged legally by oligarchs, and they won. And they won. So sanctions also have to be very, very carefully designed with intelligence, with all law enforcement mechanism, with treasury, because if you want sanctions to be effective, they have to be targeted and they have to be very well designed and not to be attacked and reversed by courts. And this is an issue as well.
So if anyone knows a dictator running out of money from sanctions, the EU wants to know about it.
Yep.
I would love to get back to our audience. I think we still have the microphone running around. If there's anyone else who'd like to ask a question. Yes, you, ma'am. You have a microphone coming to you.
Thank you. I'm Anna Nalivaiko from the Martin Center. I would like to follow up on the UN question that was briefly mentioned. I mean, obviously, besides the fact that Russia sits on the Security Council, there have been quite a few wins of African countries' abstentions, and that was a big win for Russia because of the influence that it has on the African continent. So can the collective West still use the UN for creating alliances, or is it becoming obsolete? Thank you.
Ambassador Smith, your thoughts. We had Dr. von Hippel say the world's going minilateral, not multilateral. To paraphrase you quite a bit, but
yeah, more functional. But anyway,
yes, curious. Is the UN?
I mean, the way I would frame it, again, wearing my NATO hat, is thinking about the approach that we've had inside the NATO alliance in terms of getting the message out about what we're doing, why Ukraine matters, why our support matters, why we're so focused on Ukraine. And I think initially, in the first few months after the war started, NATO allies were understandably very focused on maintaining unity within the alliance. It was the strongest card we had to play against Russian aggression, and it was absolutely critical that we showcase that unity and resolve in the face of this aggression. Over time, I think we also started to appreciate, though, that while we were focused on our own unity and shared message towards Moscow, we had to enlist the help and support of a much wider group of countries around the world, and that took us to conversations with many countries around the world about the fundamental principles of the UN Charter and what's at stake. And that brings us to territorial integrity and sovereignty. And that's where I think the conversation is ongoing. We have had, while there were countries that abstained in those critical votes at the UN, we did have over 140 countries come together and condemn what Russia has done in Ukraine. It was important. It required a lot of work, and there's still more work to do in terms of helping a wider community of countries understand, again, what's at stake. So it is imperfect in some ways, but I think NATO is looking for ways to be more effective in engaging countries around the world, not just having a conversation amongst ourselves, where we do have to maintain unity and make sure that Moscow is hearing in stereo surround sound our determination to support Ukraine, but that a wider group of countries continues to stand with Ukraine as well.
Arnaud, are you finding the UN useful these days from an EU perspective?
Well, I mean, we are all aware of shortages and problems of the UN and how it functions, but we certainly should not be the one sacrificing the UN and shooting at the UN. I mean, as it was said, the condemnation was wide in the UN. Of course, we single out the countries which have not voted like we would have liked the aggression to be condemned. But there are also, I would say, good surprises. For example, Serbia. And they were blamed by Moscow for that. We tend to see that they are aligned with Moscow because they don't apply the sanctions. Yes, indeed, and that's problematic. But at the UN, they voted like us. On territorial, for other reason probably, but I mean, who cares? The result was there. So, you know, we have to look carefully at that. And there is no better place for international law. I mean, the principles are there. It does not function. That's true. The Security Council is paralyzed, and it's not new. But we certainly should not be the one sacrificing the UN. In terms of multilateral forum, I mean, we have nothing else better than the UN at the moment to continue to work, even if we are not satisfied with it.
We're running close to the end, but Dr. von Hippel, still the best option, the United Nations?
I mean, no, it's not the best option. And you saw that the vote had to go to the General Assembly because the Security Council would not be able to condemn anything right now, right? And the Security Council hasn't been able to condemn anything for years. I worked on Syria in the U.S. State Department, and even a humanitarian resolution could not get through the Security Council. And so I think the UN is just becoming more marginalized. I think that's really the challenge. It doesn't mean countries can't work together and come up with more creative solutions. And don't forget, these institutions were formed in a very different era, and the world has changed a lot since then.
Klaus, you have the last word. Is the software working?
I mean, on the United Nations, I would like to say that I was rather impressed by some members of the permanent members, not permanent, by the members of the Security Council. I listened to a number of representatives from Africa, and they were saying, look, the argument is made that the borders are not perfect. If we were to accept this argument, we would have war every day in Africa because we have to live with borders from the colonial times. And when it came to to the protection of the territorial integrity, their really support was huge in the General Assembly. So I wouldn't see it as a negative. We are surely not surprised that Russia is not helping us to pass something in the Security Council. I think it's not so bad, and I think what Arnaud has been saying, in general, we have to listen more to others. I think that's the way forward.
Fair enough. Well, that concludes our panel. Thanks to the audience for your questions. We'll call back up Sandra to introduce the next program.